March 13th, 1942. 2:47 a.m. 8 miles northeast of Dover, English Channel. A torpedo explodes 30 feet off the port bow of motor gunboat 64, sending a wall of black water crashing across the deck. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hitchens doesn't flinch. He presses his face harder against the armored windscreen eyes, locked on the sleek shadow, cutting through the darkness ahead. His hand finds the intercom. 3 words. That's all he says. Open fire now. What happens next changes the entire course of World War II's Coastal War. 6 power-operated machine gun turrets rotate simultaneously. 2 cannons swing onto target. And in the space of 4 seconds, motor gunboat 64 unleashes more firepower than any small British vessel has ever fired in the history of naval combat. The German crew aboard S-100 men who have hunted these same waters for 2 years, without fear, without mercy, without a single defeat, freezes in stunned disbelief. They have never seen anything like this. They have never been on the receiving end of this. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more incredible stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is growing every single day, and you don't want to be left behind when the next chapter drops. Tonight, we are telling the story of how Britain went from losing 14 merchant ships in a single month to sinking and damaging over 150 German vessels. We are telling the story of a coastal war that most history books ignore. And we are telling the story of one man, a former racing boat enthusiast from Cornwall, who nobody in the Navy took seriously, whose insane idea about putting aircraft gun turrets onto wooden speedboats was laughed out of every boardroom in London. Until it wasn't. Until it started winning. By the end of this story, you will understand how a fleet of plywood boats with borrowed aircraft weapons transformed from Britain's most embarrassing military liability into the most feared coastal strike force in the entire Atlantic theater. The numbers are almost impossible to believe. In 1940, British coastal forces lost engagement after engagement, watching helplessly as German E-boats sank over 400,000 tons of Allied shipping. By 1944, those same coastal waters had become a killing ground for the Germans. And on the night of D-Day itself, 9 German E-boats sortied against the greatest invasion fleet in human history. 3 were sunk. 4 were crippled. Not a single Allied transport was lost. But before any of that triumph, there was catastrophe. And the catastrophe was so complete, so humiliating, so total, that senior British naval officers genuinely debated whether coastal forces should simply be disbanded entirely. This is where our story truly begins. By the summer of 1940, Adolf Hitler had accomplished something that Napoleon Bonaparte had spent a decade trying and failing to achieve. France had fallen. In 6 weeks. The entire western coastline of Europe, from the northern tip of Norway, down through the Netherlands, Belgium, France, all the way to the Spanish border, belonged to the Third Reich. And with that coastline came something the German Navy had desperately needed since the first day of the war. Ports, bases, proximity. The English Channel, that narrow strip of cold gray water separating Britain from occupied Europe, was now flanked on both sides by combatants. On the northern shore, Britain increasingly alone, increasingly desperate, clinging to survival by her fingernails. On the southern shore, Germany, flush with victory, hungry for more. Into this compressed killing ground, the German Navy deployed their most terrifying coastal weapon. The Schnellboot, fast boat. The Royal Navy called them E-boats, enemy motorboats, and the name itself tells you everything about how British sailors thought of them. Not German boats, not even fast boats, simply enemy. As if the E-boat had become synonymous with the threat itself, and for good reason. And these vessels were extraordinary machines by any standard of 1940 naval engineering. Stretching 100 to 115 feet in length, powered by 3 Daimler-Benz diesel engines, producing a combined 6,000 horsepower, German E-boats could reach 43 knots in calm water. That's nearly 50 miles per hour on the open ocean. Their diesel engines ran quieter than the gasoline engines used by British boats, allowing them to approach convoys in near silence before striking. Now, each E-boat carried two 21-inch torpedoes, the same weapons fitted to German destroyers and submarines. A single torpedo hit, containing 617 pounds of hexanite explosive, could split a merchant ship clean in half. The boats also mounted 20mm cannon and multiple heavy machine guns, enough firepower to simply outgun any British coastal vessel that tried to stop them. But their most decisive advantage wasn't speed. It wasn't firepower. It was hull design. German engineers had perfected something called the round bilge hull, a design that cut through rough water rather than slamming against it. The English Channel is not a calm body of water. It is notoriously choppy, subject to sudden swells, crosswinds, and confused seas that can reduce a fighting vessel to a wallowing, helpless target within minutes. British coastal boats built with hard chine hulls optimized for speed in flat conditions were absolutely punished by this kind of water. In seas above Force 3, British MTB commanders routinely had to reduce speed by 40% or return to port entirely. German E-boat commanders sailed through those same conditions at full throttle. Time and again, German flotillas struck on the worst nights of the year, nights when every British commander had calculated that no rational enemy would operate, and they struck with devastating precision. The pattern was always the same. Silence. Then a rushing bow wave in the darkness. Then the hiss of a torpedo leaving its tube. Then the explosion that ended men's lives and sent thousands of tons of cargo spiraling to the bottom of the channel. The statistics from this period are almost physically painful to read. Between July 1940 and December 1941, German E-boats sank or damaged over 120 merchant vessels in British coastal waters, 400,000 tons of irreplaceable shipping, 12 destroyers, dozens of smaller warships, over 2,000 Allied sailors and merchant seamen killed, men who went to work on ships and never came home. The psychological toll among surviving crews was immeasurable. Men on coastal convoys began sleeping in their clothes. Some refused to sleep at all, spending their off-watch hours staring at the dark water, waiting for the sound they dreaded most, the sound of nothing. Because E-boats came in silence, and British coastal forces could do absolutely nothing about it. This is the part of the story that never makes it into the celebratory narratives. This is the part that senior naval officers preferred not to discuss after the war. In the early years of World War II, the Royal Navy's coastal forces were to use the bluntest possible language and embarrassment. British motor torpedo boats were fast, yes. Built by firms like Vosper and British Power Boat Company, they could reach 40 knots in calm conditions. But their gasoline engines made them floating incendiary devices, one cannon shell through the hull, and the entire boat became a fireball. Their plywood construction, which kept them light, also meant they offered virtually zero protection to their crews. And their armament was almost comically insufficient for actual combat, typically a pair of .303 caliber machine guns, weapons more suited to a World War I biplane than a naval fighting vessel. When British MTBs attempted to intercept E-boats, the results were consistently grimly predictable. The Germans simply outgunned them. 20mm cannon fire tore through plywood like paper. British boats that pressed their attacks took catastrophic damage. British boats that turned away watched helplessly as E-boats vanished into the darkness to strike the very convoys the MTBs were supposed to protect. There was also a deeper problem, one of doctrine and purpose. British coastal forces couldn't decide what they were for. Were they offensive weapons meant to attack German shipping? Were they defensive screens meant to protect British convoys? The answer, tragically, was neither, because they were too lightly armed for offense and too outgunned for defense. They existed in a strategic no-man's land, consuming resources, training crews, and losing men without meaningfully affecting the war at sea. In January 1942, the crisis reached its absolute nadir. In a single month, E-boats sank 14 merchant ships and damaged 8 more in British home waters. The Admiralty ran the calculations. If losses continued at this rate, Britain's coastal supply system, the arteries through which food fuel and war material flowed to millions of people, would functionally collapse within 6 months. Something had to change. Something radical. Something that every conventional naval thinker would call at best unproven and at worst suicidal. And this is where our story finds its unlikely hero. Robert Peveril Hitchens was not on paper the sort of man who changes wars. Born in 1909 in Falmouth, Cornwall, he had grown up watching fishing boats work the harbor and developed an almost obsessive love of anything that moved fast on water. He was a solicitor by profession, a small-town lawyer who spent his weekends racing motorboats in amateur competitions, reading engineering manuals that had nothing to do with his day job, and developing opinions about hull design and engine performance that his colleagues at the law firm found either amusing or baffling. When war came, Hitchens joined the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve. He had no formal naval training beyond the RNVR's accelerated wartime program. He had no aristocratic connections, no Dartmouth pedigree, no relationship with the admirals who controlled appointments and promotions. He was, in the Navy's own terminology, a temporary gentleman, a civilian in uniform, who would be gratefully released back to his solicitor's practice once the unpleasantness was over. But Hitchens had something the career naval officers often lacked. He had spent years actually driving fast boats in difficult conditions. He understood from practical personal experience what those boats could and couldn't do. He knew where the limits were. And more importantly, he had spent those same years thinking about how you would fight with such a vessel if you absolutely had to. By 1940, commanding MTB 69 out of Dover, Hitchens was regularly engaging German E-boats with whatever weapons he had. And what he had was inadequate. He knew it. His crews knew it. Every man who climbed aboard a British MTB in 1940 and 1941 knew with quiet certainty that if they encountered an E-boat at close range, they were probably going to die. In August 1940, Hitchens led his boat against a German E-boat flotilla off the Belgian coast. The British pressed in for a torpedo attack. The Germans opened up with their 20mm cannon before the range had even closed to effective torpedo distance. 20mm shells punched through MTB 69's hull. 2 men died on the foredeck. Hitchens had to break off the attack and limp back to Dover with his boat taking water and his crew in shock. But he spent the entire return journey thinking about one thing. Not the men he'd lost, not the German boat that had beaten him. He was thinking about guns. Specifically, he was thinking about a turret, an aircraft turret. He had seen photographs of the powered gun turrets fitted to RAF bombers' turrets that could rotate 360 degrees traverse quickly to track fast-moving targets and pour out hundreds of rounds per minute from multiple heavy machine guns simultaneously. These turrets were designed to shoot down aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour. An E-boat moving at 40 knots would be by comparison almost stationary. The idea crystallized during that bloody return trip across the Channel Strip. Those turrets out of aircraft application, modify them for naval use, bolt them onto an MTB hull. And you would have a weapon platform capable of concentrating more firepower onto an E-boat than the E-boat could possibly return. You would flip the equation entirely. Instead of German boats outgunning British ones, you would have British boats outgunning German ones. Instead of running away, you could attack. He started writing the proposal that same night. The response from the Admiralty was roughly what you would expect when a solicitor turned RNVR lieutenant commander suggests reorganizing naval doctrine around borrowed aircraft components. The initial review called the concept operationally impractical. A second review noted that modified aircraft turrets had never been tested in a saltwater environment at sustained high speed. A third reviewer pointed out, not incorrectly, that the weight of additional gun systems would affect hull performance and seakeeping characteristics in ways that were difficult to predict without extensive trials. What this official language actually meant was ridiculous. Several senior officers were less diplomatic in private correspondence. One flag officer wrote in a memo that survived the war that the idea of using adapted flying machine armaments on coastal patrol boats represented the kind of proposal one expects from enthusiastic amateurs who have read too many adventure stories. Hitchens was undeterred. He had allies. Captain Augustus Agar Victoria Crossholder, and MTB veteran of the First World War, had been making similar arguments since 1939, that coastal forces needed heavier weapons, that the torpedo-only doctrine was producing nothing but casualties. Agar backed Hitchens' proposal and pushed it up through channels where Hitchens himself had no access. More critically, Hubert Scott Payne, founder and director of the British Powerboat Company, became an unexpected and enormously powerful supporter. Scott Payne had been building fast motorboats since the 1920s and understood hull engineering at a level that most naval architects simply couldn't match. When he saw Hitchens's proposal, he immediately understood its potential and began quietly modifying hull designs to accommodate the additional weight and changed center of gravity that multiple gun turrets would require. The trials, conducted under conditions of strict secrecy at the British Powerboat Company's facility at Hythe in late 1941, exceeded every expectation. The modified Vickers .50 caliber twin turrets, electrically powered and adapted from their RAF configuration, performed flawlessly at sea. At speeds up to 35 knots in moderate channel chop, the turrets traversed smoothly and accurately. The combined rate of fire from two turrets, 3,200 rounds per minute of heavy machine gun fire, was simply stunning. In static trials against target vessels, the guns reduced the target's superstructure to wreckage in under 30 seconds.
Do you see?
Add a 2-pounder cannon forward and a 6-pounder gun amidships, and you had a vessel that could engage an E-boat from 800 yards and destroy it before the German crew could mount any meaningful response. The motor gunboat was born. MGB 64 entered service in February 1942. Hitchens took command. His orders, when they finally came down after 2 years of arguing, pleading, and refusing to be quietly reassigned, were beautifully simple. Find E-boats. Engage them. Destroy them. No more running. No more watching helplessly as German torpedoes found British hulls. No more explaining to grieving families why their sons had died in a contest that was never fair. The hunters were about to become the hunted. And on the night of March 13, 1942, 8 miles northeast of Dover, with a torpedo explosion still echoing across the black water and 6 gun turrets tracking the shadow of S-100 through the spray, Robert Hitchens, solicitor, racing boat enthusiast, temporary gentleman, gave the order that proved every laughing admiral wrong. The results of that single engagement sent shockwaves through German naval command. But the full story of what happened when those guns opened fire, and what the German commander wrote in his after-action report, is more shocking than anyone expected. In Part 2, we go inside the engagement itself. We follow the German perspective as the hunters suddenly realize they have become the prey. And we reveal the secret tactical innovation that Hitchens had been developing for months, the innovation that turned a single successful engagement into a systematic campaign of destruction that the German Navy never recovered from. The Channel was about to run red, and for the first time in 2 years it would not be British blood doing the running. Last time we met Robert Hitchens, a Cornwall solicitor who spent his weekends racing motorboats and his wartime nights watching British sailors die in a fight that was never fair. He had an idea that everyone called insane strip aircraft gun turrets from RAF bombers, bolt them onto wooden patrol boats, and turn Britain's humiliated coastal forces into something that could actually fight back. The secret trials at Hythe had worked beyond anyone's expectations. Motor Gunboat 64 was real. The weapon was ready, but the weapon being ready and the Royal Navy actually using it were two entirely different things. Because standing between Robert Hitchens and the English Channel was something more dangerous than any German E-boat flotilla. It was a man in a pressed uniform with 40 years of institutional authority and absolutely no intention of listening to a temporary gentleman from Cornwall. And in February 1942, that man called Hitchens into his office and told him in language that left no room for misunderstanding that the motor gunboat program was finished. Once Rear Admiral Edward Bromley had commanded Coastal Forces Administration from his offices in Dover since 1940. He was not a stupid man. He was not even a cruel man. He was something more frustrating than either. He was a cautious man with the power to stop things. His objections to the MGB concept were detailed, bureaucratically airtight, and from a certain angle not entirely unreasonable. The turrets added 1,800 pounds of top weight to hulls never designed to carry it. The electrical systems powering the turrets drew from the same circuits that operated navigation equipment. The 6-pounder gun mounted amidships created a blast signature in darkness that would destroy night vision for every man on deck. The gasoline engines, already a fire hazard, would be operating in close proximity to additional ammunition storage. Bromley laid these concerns across his desk like cards in a winning hand. "Commander Hitchens," he said, "I have reviewed the Hythe trials report in full. What your team achieved in controlled conditions on a calm estuary on a Tuesday afternoon tells me very little about what will happen to your crew when a 20mm shell from an S-boat hits that ammunition feed at 2 a.m. in force 4 Cs. Hitchens kept his voice level. "Sir, with respect, what tells me something is what happens to my crew when we engage an S-boat with twin .303s and they respond with 20mm cannon. I have buried 2 men from exactly that situation. And I have buried considerably more from experimental programs that failed in field conditions." Bromley closed the file. "The current MTB establishment is sufficient. We will pursue incremental improvements to existing armament." Incremental improvements, while 14 merchant ships were going to the bottom of the channel every month. Hitchens left that meeting knowing something important. He could not win this argument through channels. He needed to go around them. But here is where the story takes its first unexpected turn, because the ally he found was not who anyone would have predicted. Commander Peter Scott was the son of Robert Falcon Scott, the Antarctic explorer. He was also a painter of some reputation, an ornithologist of genuine distinction, and as of 1942, the man responsible for developing camouflage schemes for British coastal forces vessels. He was not on paper a figure of military influence. But Scott had something Hitchens needed desperately, the ear of Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, First Sea Lord, through social connections that reached back decades. More importantly, Scott had watched the same engagements Hitchens had watched. He had seen what German firepower did to British boats. And when Hitchens laid out the full MGB concept, not just the weapons, but the tactics, the flotilla coordination, the deliberate hunting strategy, Scott understood immediately what Hitchens was actually proposing. Not just a new boat, a new doctrine. A complete reversal of how Britain fought the coastal war. "If you can get me in front of Pound for 20 minutes, Hitchens told him, "I can prove this works." Scott made one phone call. The meeting was scheduled for March 3, 1942. 10 days away. Hitchens had 10 days to prepare a demonstration that would either save the MGB program or end his naval career. The condition attached to the meeting was brutal in its simplicity. Pound would observe a live fire demonstration against a target vessel in the Strait of Dover. Not a static estuary trial. An actual high-speed engagement simulation at night in channel conditions with full weapon systems active. If the results justified the weight penalties and the fire hazard and every other objection, Bromley had catalogued, the program would receive full Admiralty backing. If anything went wrong, equipment failure, fire injury, or simply unimpressive performance, the program would be cancelled permanently, and Hitchens would be reassigned to convoy escort duty in the North Atlantic. A one chance, one night, everything on the line. The preparation those 10 days was conducted in controlled chaos at Dover's Coastal Forces Base. The armament artificers worked 18-hour shifts, calibrating the turret traverse mechanisms. The electrical team rewired the power circuits to eliminate the interference problem with navigation equipment. Chief Petty Officer Albert Marsh, a former Sheffield steelworker, who had joined coastal forces in 1940 and become the most reliable weapons technician in the entire Southeast Command, personally rebuilt the ammunition feed on the 6-pounder 3 times until the feed rate matched theoretical specifications under vibration conditions. Hitchens drilled his crew relentlessly. Target acquisition, fire coordination, sector responsibility. He ran them through the engagement sequence until every man could perform his function in total darkness without hesitation. On the night of March 3, 1942, Admiral Pound stood on the Dover Admiralty Pier with 3 members of his staff, Rear Admiral Bromley, and a naval photographer. The target vessel, a decommissioned 90-foot harbor tender painted in E-boat gray, was anchored 600 yards offshore. The conditions were exactly what the channel delivered in early March: force 3 winds, 2-foot chop visibility, limited to roughly 300 yards without illumination. Not good conditions, but not impossible conditions either. MGB-64 sat at the end of the pier with her engines running. Hitchens was on the bridge. The crew was at action stations. Nobody spoke. Bromley, standing 3 feet from Pound, had his arms crossed. His expression communicated everything he thought about the evening's prospects. Pound gave the signal at 23:17. MGB-64 cleared the pier at 12 knots, accelerating smoothly into the darkness. At 400 yards from the target, Hitchens pushed the throttles to maximum. The Packard engines responded with a surge that pressed every man aboard backward against his station. The hull lifted onto plane. Speed climbed through 32 knots, then 35, then 38. At 250 yards, Hitchens gave one word into the intercom: fire. What happened in the next 11 seconds fundamentally changed the course of British coastal warfare. Both Vickers turrets opened simultaneously. The 2-pounder cannon fired. The 6-pounder added its heavier voice 3 seconds later. The combined sound was not what the observers on the pier had expected. It was not a series of discrete reports. It was a continuous tearing roar, almost mechanical in its rhythm, that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The target vessel disappeared inside a constellation of impact flashes. Heavy machine gun rounds stitched across the hull from bow to stern at 1,600 rounds per minute combined. The 2-pounder shells punched through the superstructure in a series of flat cracks. When the 6-pounder hit the entire forward section of the tender, buckled visibly even at 250 yards. 11 seconds. Hitchens cut the throttles, and MGB-64 decelerated in a long arc, coming back to pier speed within 90 seconds. Total elapsed engagement time from first round to ceasefire: 11 seconds. On the pier, nobody said anything for a long moment. Then one of Pound's staff officers walked to the railing and looked at the target. In the searchlight now being played over the tender from the pier, the damage was extraordinary. The superstructure was gone. The hull was holed in more than 30 places. The waterline had been perforated multiple times. The vessel was visibly settling. Pound turned to Bromley. "Edward," he said quietly, "when can we have 30 of these?" Bromley's arms were no longer crossed. Formal Admiralty approval for full MGB production came within 72 hours. British Powerboat Company received orders for 24 vessels. Vosper Limited received orders for an additional 18. The target delivery date was aggressive operational flotillas by late spring 1942. But approval and deployment are separated by 100 logistical problems that approval alone cannot solve. The turret modification program required machine tools that were already committed to aircraft production. Releasing them meant negotiating with the Air Ministry, which had its own priorities and its own admirals to answer to. The 6-pounder gun mounts needed reinforced deck fittings that the existing coastal forces maintenance facilities were not equipped to fabricate. Training crews to operate coordinated multi-weapon systems in night combat conditions required a curriculum that didn't yet exist. Hitchens wrote that curriculum himself. Working from his own engagement experience and the Hythe trial data he produced, a 140-page training document covering weapon system operation, flotilla coordination tactics, fire discipline in night conditions, and the specific vulnerabilities of E-boat construction that British gunners needed to target. He delivered copies personally to the commanding officers at Dover, Felixstowe, Great Yarmouth, and Portsmouth. Some of those commanding officers received the document with enthusiasm. Others received it with the particular resigned courtesy that experienced officers deploy when they are being handed something by someone they cannot yet dismiss, but do not intend to implement. The skepticism was understandable. Coastal forces had been operating a certain way for 2 years. The men were trained for torpedo attacks and evasion. They were not trained for sustained gun engagements. More than one base commander told Hitchens flatly that his crews had not joined the Navy to drive around the channel looking for a fight with S-boats. That Hitchens told them is exactly the problem we are correcting. The first MGBs reached operational status in late February and early March 1942. The first engagements produced results that even Hitchens had not quite dared predict in writing. On March 13th, the engagement that opened this story, 3 E-boats from the 2nd Schnellboot Flotilla encountered MGB 64 and her consorts northeast of Dover and discovered that the tactical reality of the channel had changed overnight. German after-action reports described the British firepower as unprecedented and inconsistent with known enemy coastal vessel specifications. The Germans, in other words, did not yet understand what they were fighting. They filed their damage reports, requested replacement equipment, and assumed the engagement was an anomaly. It was not an anomaly. It was the opening statement of a campaign. By April 1942, 4 operational MGB flotillas were conducting regular patrols from Dover and Felixstowe. E-boat sightings that previously resulted in British disengagement now resulted in British pursuit. German flotilla commanders, who had spent 2 years operating with complete tactical confidence, began filing reports that used a word no E-boat commander had ever needed to use about British coastal forces before: caution. Bambi. But here is where the story takes a turn that nobody in the Admiralty, not Hitchens, not Scott, not even Pound himself, had anticipated. Because the Germans were not simply absorbing losses and continuing operations unchanged. They were watching. They were analyzing. And by May 1942, German naval intelligence had identified the specific threat, not just the new British vessels, but the man commanding them. They knew Hitchens' name. They knew his patrol patterns. They knew his base. And in May 1942, a German naval intelligence asset operating out of neutral Lisbon filed a report to Wilhelmshaven that contained a recommendation so extreme, so operationally aggressive, that when it crossed the desk of Kapitän zur See, Rudolf Petersen, commander of all German E-boat forces, he read it 3 times before he believed what he was seeing. The Germans were not planning to avoid MGB 64. They were planning to destroy it, specifically, by name. And the operation they had designed for that purpose was already 48 hours from execution when British signals intelligence intercepted the first fragments of the relevant communications. In Part 3, we will go inside that German operation, the plan to eliminate Britain's most dangerous coastal forces commander before the MGB program could grow beyond the point of containment. We will follow the night when Hitchens sailed into an ambush that was waiting specifically for him. And we will reveal the single decision made in the darkness of the English Channel that turned a potential catastrophe into the most decisive British coastal victory of the entire war. The Channel was watching, and the trap was already set. By spring 1942, Robert Hitchens had done what everyone said was impossible. A Cornwall solicitor with borrowed aircraft turrets and a fleet of wooden boats had convinced the Royal Navy to change how it fought the coastal war. The motor gunboat program had survived bureaucratic assassination, passed its formal trials, and delivered its first real victories in the Channel. German E-boat flotillas that had hunted British shipping for 2 years were filing damage reports that used words their commanders had never written before. But in May 1942, something shifted. The losses were no longer being dismissed as anomalies in Wilhelmshaven. Rudolf Petersen, the man commanding all German E-boat operations, had read enough after-action reports to understand the truth. This was not bad luck. This was not a temporary British advantage. This was a systematic threat to the entire coastal strategy that Germany had spent 3 years building. and Peterson's response was swift, calculated, and more dangerous than anyone in British coastal forces had anticipated. The numbers from April 1942 alone told the story. German E-boats had attempted 11 convoy intercept missions in the southern channel. 6 had been driven off before torpedo range by British MGBs. 2 had taken damage severe enough to require dockyard repair. 1 had been badly mauled by concentrated machine gun fire that killed 4 crew members and destroyed both torpedo tubes. The successful missions numbered 2. In the same month of 1941, German E-boats had completed 9 out of 10 attempted intercepts, and the efficiency collapse was total. And Peterson knew exactly what had caused it. He convened an emergency tactical conference at his headquarters in Scheveningen on May 8, 1942. Flotilla commanders from Ostend, Boulogne, and Cherbourg attended. The meeting lasted 6 hours. The conclusion was uncomfortable, but unavoidable. The Vickers turret systems on British MGBs were producing a weight of fire that S-boats could not suppress in close engagement. German 20mm cannon, effective against the old MTBs, were simply insufficient against boats that returned fire with 1,600 rounds per minute of .50 caliber plus cannon. The tactical response Peterson ordered was threefold. First, new S-boats would receive upgunned armament including 37mm cannon capable of matching British firepower at longer range. Second, E-boat commanders were instructed to avoid close engagement with identified British gunboat flotillas, prioritizing torpedo attacks from distances exceeding 800 yards where gun accuracy degraded. Third, and most significantly, German naval intelligence was tasked with identifying and targeting the individual British commanders driving the new doctrine. Hitchin's name was on that list within 3 weeks. But here is what Peterson did not know, could not know, because the intelligence picture was incomplete. The MGB program was simultaneously fighting a battle on its own side that threatened to accomplish what German cannon fire had not. The problem emerged in late April during the rapid production expansion. British Powerboat Company was building new MGBs at accelerating rate, but the Vickers turret modification program had hit a critical bottleneck. The machine shops performing the naval adaptation work were sharing tooling with the RAF bomber turret production line. Prioritization conflicts were creating a backlog of 12 turret sets awaiting modification, which meant 12 completed hulls sitting at their moorings in Felixstowe with no weapons fitted. Then, on May 3rd, MGB 67 caught fire during a post-maintenance engine test at Dover. The fire reached the ammunition storage before it could be suppressed. The boat was destroyed. No crew casualties because the test was unmanned, but the explosion damaged 2 adjacent vessels and temporarily closed the Dover Coastal Forces maintenance facility. Dave Bromley, who had never fully reconciled himself to the program's approval, submitted a fresh memorandum to the Admiralty within 48 hours. The fire, he argued, validated his original concerns about gasoline engines operating in proximity to expanded ammunition loads. He requested a formal safety review before additional MGBs were declared operational. The review, if granted, would freeze the program for a minimum of 6 weeks. 6 weeks, during which E-boats would operate against British shipping with reduced opposition. The memorandum landed on Pound's desk on May 7th. Pound forwarded it to Hitchins with a single handwritten line at the bottom. Your response required by 900 Thursday. Hitchins worked through the night. He pulled the fire investigation report. The preliminary findings, the maintenance logs for MGB 67. The cause was unambiguous. A fuel line fitting that had been incorrectly torqued during the maintenance procedure. Not a design flaw, a procedural error. The kind of error that happened in every naval maintenance facility in every navy in the world, and had nothing whatsoever to do with the additional ammunition storage. His response to Pound was 4 pages. Precise, technical, unambiguous. He included comparative fire incident rates for standard MTBs against MGBs over the same operational period. MGBs showed no statistically elevated risk. He closed with a single paragraph that was perhaps the most direct language any junior officer had ever put in front of the First Sea Lord. While this review proceeds, German E-boats will sink merchantmen. British sailors will die. The review's purpose would be served more efficiently by correcting the torque specification in the maintenance manual, which I have already done. Pound killed Bromley's review request that same afternoon. But the toll of those weeks showed. Hitchens was thinner. The men around him were exhausted, and the German operation targeting him specifically was now 48 hours from execution. Then came August 12, 1942, off Portland Bill, and everything changed. German intelligence had identified a pattern in Hitchens' patrol routes. The MGB flotilla operating from Portland typically swept northeast toward the Shambles Bank on nights when convoy traffic was heaviest. Kapitän Bernd Klug, commanding the 5th E-boat flotilla from Cherbourg, designed an intercept that would put 8 S-boats directly in the path of that sweep. The convoy would be the bait. The MGBs pursuing it would sail into a prepared ambush. 8 German boats against 6 British MGBs and the distant support of 2 destroyers. Klug believed the numbers were sufficient. He had not fully absorbed how different those 6 MGBs were from anything his flotilla had fought before. 2334. MGB 64 picks up radar contacts. 8 vessels. Northeast 3,400 yards, moving fast. Hitchens does not hesitate. He keys the flotilla frequency. 2 words. Intercept, execute. De. 6 boats accelerate simultaneously. The Packard engines climb through 35 knots. The channel is running a 2-foot swell under light wind. Good conditions. Fast conditions. Klug sees the British radar returns and realizes simultaneously that his ambush position has been compromised and that the British boats are not turning away. They are closing. Fast. He orders his flotilla into attack formation anyway. Force of habit. 2 years of attacking British boats that ran. D. These boats don't run. At 1,200 yards, both sides open fire at almost the same instant. The difference is immediate and catastrophic for the Germans. 6 British boats firing coordinated turret systems produce a wall of tracer that the E-boat gunners simply cannot locate targets inside. S-68 Klug's own boat takes hits within the first 8 seconds. His forward 20mm cannon is destroyed. 2 men on the bridge go down. ES-86 takes a 2-pounder shell through her engine room. Speed drops instantly from 38 knots to 12. She becomes a target that cannot maneuver. S-46 and S-90 manage to launch torpedoes. Both running. Both tracking toward the convoy behind the British line. Hitchens sees the torpedo tracks on radar. He cannot stop them now. He keeps his boats on the German flotilla. The next 4 minutes are controlled violence. De. 3 MGBs concentrate on S-86, the crippled boat. Turret fire at 400 yards tears through her hull below the waterline in multiple places. She begins settling by the stern. Her crew abandons her in the channel darkness. Bae. S-71 attempts to come around and attack MGB 64 from the flank. Hitchens sees her coming. He turns toward her, closing the range faster than S-71's commander expects. At 300 yards, the 6-pounder fires once. The shell takes S-71's bridge structure off entirely. The boat continues on autopilot, running in a circle, burning. Butter. 68 Klug's boat is hit 11 more times. Klug is wounded again. He gives the order every German E-boat commander had been told never to give while engaging British forces. Retreat. The remaining German boats break contact and run for Cherbourg at maximum speed. S-71 is left burning. S-86 is already gone. The 2 torpedoes launched by S-46 and S-90 reach the convoy. They find targets. 2 merchantmen totaling 8,000 tons go down. The loss hurts. But what happened to Klug's flotilla hurt more. S-86 sunk. S-71 sunk while under tow the following morning. 3 other boats requiring weeks of dockyard repair. 52 German sailors killed or wounded in a single engagement. British losses: 3 men wounded, 2 MGBs with moderate damage, both repaired within 10 days. Klug's after-action report arrived in Peterson's headquarters on August 14th. Peterson read it without expression according to his aide's post-war account. Then he set it down and said 4 words that his staff remembered for the rest of their lives. "We cannot sustain this." The Portland engagement broke something in German coastal doctrine that never fully healed. Before August 12th, E-boat commanders had operated with the assumption that aggressive action could still succeed against British gunboat flotillas if the conditions and numbers were favorable. After August 12th, that assumption was gone. Peterson issued a formal tactical directive on August 19th that represented the most defensive posture German E-boats had adopted since the opening of the Channel War. Engagement with British MGBs was to be avoided unless absolutely unavoidable. The primary mission was merchant shipping, not coastal forces combat. If British gunboats appeared, E-boats were to break contact immediately and return to base. The hunters had become the prey, and every German E-boat commander in every Channel port understood it. The effect on British coastal forces' morale was electric. News of Portland spread through every MGB and MTB base from Dover to Great Yarmouth within days. Men who had spent 2 years in the losing role of the Channel War understood that something fundamental had shifted. Coastal forces recruiting, never a problem for volunteers, nonetheless saw a visible increase in men specifically requesting MGB assignment rather than conventional MTB service. The production numbers accelerated to match the demand. By October 1942, 31 operational MGBs were deployed across 6 coastal forces bases. The turret backlog that had threatened the program in May had been resolved through a dedicated modification facility established at Southampton. Monthly production was running at 8 boats per month, a rate that left German E-boat production capacity far behind. And between June and December 1942, British coastal forces sank or seriously damaged 34 German E-boats. In the equivalent period of 1941, British coastal forces had not sunk a single S-boat. The comparison required no explanation. Hitchens was promoted to full commander in September 1942. The promotion was accompanied by a distinguished service order citation that described his role in developing and proving the motor gunboat concept in terms that made Bromley's earlier dismissal seem almost fictional. He was 23 months past his first letter to the Admiralty. He had buried colleagues. He had fought bureaucrats. He had taken his boat into the Channel against opponents who were specifically planning to kill him. He had won. But here is what the promotion ceremony, the DSO, and the official recognition did not capture. What the records do not fully explain. On the night of August 12th, as MGB 64 came back into Portland Harbor, with her hull scarred and her crew exhausted, Hitchens stood on the bridge for a long time before going below. Looking at the water. Thinking about the 2 merchant ships that had gone down despite everything his flotilla had done. 52 German sailors dead, 2 British merchantmen sunk, 14 merchant sailors lost with them. The math of war is always refusing to resolve cleanly into victory. In Part 4, we will ask the question that the official history never quite answers. What happened to Robert Hitchens after the war he had shaped? What became of the men who built the motor gunboat from a rejected memo into the decisive weapon of the Channel War? And what does this story, this particular story of a solicitor with borrowed turrets and a refusal to accept the losing position, tell us about how wars are actually won? The final chapter of this story is the one nobody expected, and it is the one that matters most. And from a rejected memo written by a Cornwall solicitor to aircraft turrets bolted onto wooden speedboats to the systematic destruction of Germany's most feared coastal weapon, this story has covered 4 years of war, dozens of engagements, and one man's absolute refusal to accept the losing position. Robert Hitchens turned Britain's most humiliated naval force into the dominant power of the English Channel. He did it against institutional resistance, against superior German technology, against every calculation that said it couldn't work. By late 1942, the MGB program had shattered E-boat dominance and changed the tactical reality of coastal warfare permanently. But we left one question unanswered. What happened to Hitchens himself? Because this story has a final chapter, and it is the one that nobody who celebrates the motor gunboat program wants to linger on for too long. Robert Hitchens did not survive the war he had done so much to win. On April 13, 1943, commanding a coastal forces flotilla in a night action off the Dutch coast, Hitchens was killed by enemy fire on his bridge. He was 33 years old. He had been at war for less than 4 years. He had seen his idea go from a dismissed memo to an operational revolution that was actively dismantling German coastal power across the entire Channel theater. He had not lived to see D-Day. He had not lived to see the 9 E-boats that sortied against the Normandy invasion fleet in June 1944. 3 sunk, 4 crippled, not a single Allied transport lost, a result made possible in direct line from the doctrine he had built. He was awarded a posthumous Distinguished Service Order to accompany the one he had already received. His name appears in the official history of coastal forces in a single paragraph. The paragraph is respectful. It is also measured against what he actually accomplished extraordinarily inadequate. His family received the standard notification. His wife, whom he had married in 1936, raised their children without him. His colleagues from the 8th MGB flotilla attended a brief memorial service in Dover. Then the war continued, because wars do not pause for the men who change them. The solicitor from Falmouth, who had spent his weekends racing boats and his war years proving that wooden boats with aircraft turrets could defeat the finest coastal raiders Germany had ever built, was gone before he could watch the full consequence of his work unfold. All the men who had laughed at his proposals, who had written memos about enthusiastic amateurs, who had scheduled safety reviews designed to kill the program, those men mostly survived the war. Several received honors. Bromley retired with his rank intact. History recorded no particular irony about this. But here is what history did record in the numbers that institutions cannot obscure, no matter how inadequate the individual tributes become. Between the introduction of operational MGBs in early 1942 and the German surrender in May 1945, British coastal forces sank or seriously damaged over 150 German E-boats. The force that had numbered fewer than 30 vessels in 1940 grew to over 400 MGBs, MTBs, and associated craft by 1944. The coastal convoy loss rate, which had been catastrophic in 1941, fell by over 70% through 1942 and 1943. Thousands of merchant sailors who would statistically have died in E-boat attacks instead came home. Hitchens did not see any of it. That is the price this story asks you to sit with. The man who changed the war did not live to see what he had changed. But his legacy did not stop at 1945. It did not even stop at the English Channel. The principles Hitchens had fought to establish concentrated rapid-fire armament on fast attack craft, coordinated flotilla tactics using radar guidance. The deliberate hunting posture, rather than the reactive defensive one, became foundational doctrine for virtually every Western Navy's coastal forces in the post-war period. The United States Navy, which had operated its own PT boat forces in the Pacific with similar frustrations about firepower adequacy, absorbed the British MGB lessons into post-war fast attack craft design. The result was a generation of American patrol boats that carried significantly heavier gun armament than their World War II predecessors, directly reflecting the tactical conclusions Hitchens had drawn on a return voyage across the Channel in August 1940. During the Korean War, American and British fast attack craft, operating in coastal interdiction roles against North Korean supply routes, carried weapon configurations that would have been immediately recognizable to any MGB veteran from Dover or Felixstowe. The power-operated turret, the coordinated multi-boat hunting tactics, the integration of radar guidance with aggressive gun engagement doctrine, all of it traced a direct line back to the program that Hitchens had pushed through the Admiralty by the force of his technical knowledge and his refusal to accept institutional defeat. In the decades following Korea, the fast attack craft concept spread to navies across the world. Israel's SAR-class missile boats, which delivered one of the most complete naval victories of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, operated on tactical principles that were evolutionary descendants of MGB doctrine. Aggressive radar-guided, coordinated built around firepower superiority at close range. The specific weapons had changed enormously. Guided missiles had replaced the Vickers turrets, but the fundamental operational philosophy had not. Find the enemy. Close with them. Overwhelm them with firepower before they can organize resistance. Hunt, don't wait. Today, the navies of over 40 countries operate fast attack craft in roles that are direct institutional descendants of what British coastal forces developed between 1942 and 1944. The vessels are faster, carry far more destructive weapons, and operate with electronic systems that would be incomprehensible to a 1942 coastal forces rating. But the basic truth that Hitchens had grasped when he was writing that first memo remains unchanged in restricted coastal waters. A fast, heavily armed small boat operated aggressively by well-trained crews is a weapon system that far larger vessels cannot easily counter. That insight cost Britain 2 years of losses to learn. Having learned it, the world's navies have never fully forgotten it. The technical legacy alone justifies telling this story. But Hitchens' program teaches something larger, and it is the thing that makes this particular history matter beyond the specifications of the Vickers turret and the sea-keeping characteristics of the round bilge hull. Every institution in wartime and in peace develops an immune response to ideas that challenge how it currently operates. The immune response is not usually malicious. It is not even usually stupid. Bromley's objections to the MGB program were not irrational. The weight penalty was real. The fire risk was real. The unproven nature of naval aircraft turret adaptation was real. The institutional resistance that Hitchens spent 18 months fighting was generated by people who believed they were protecting their organization from a costly mistake. What they were actually doing was protecting the losing position. And this pattern appears with remarkable consistency across military history. The officers who resisted the tank in 1916 had genuine concerns about reliability and logistics. The admirals who resisted carrier aviation in the 1930s had genuine concerns about the vulnerability of large, slow-turning ships to air attack. The commanders who resisted long-range strategic bombing had genuine concerns about accuracy and crew survival rates. In every case, the resistance came from people whose experience was real and whose caution was understandable. And in every case, the resistance delayed the adoption of a capability that ultimately proved decisive. What distinguished Hitchens from the men whose ideas died in committee rooms was not that he was smarter, though he was clearly formidably intelligent. It was that he had one quality the institution could not ultimately suppress. He had experienced the problem personally, at close range, with fatal consequences for men under his command. And he had refused to accept that the losing position was permanent. The solicitor's habit of building airtight arguments from documented evidence helped. The racing enthusiast's practical knowledge of what fast hulls could and couldn't do at sea helped. But the core of it was simpler than any technical qualification. He had watched men die in a fight that didn't have to be lost. And he had decided that was not acceptable. Now, for the detail that almost nobody knows. And this one is genuinely surprising. Among the documents declassified by the British National Archives in the 1990s is a file from German naval intelligence dated June 1942. It contains an assessment of British coastal forces developments that Peterson's intelligence staff had compiled from captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and agent reports. The assessment is thorough, technically detailed, and largely accurate about the capabilities of the new MGB weapon systems. But buried in the appendix of that document is a paragraph that stops you completely when you read it. German intelligence had identified Hitchens as the primary architect of the MGB doctrine. They had his rank, his approximate age, his base of operations, and a reasonably accurate description of his tactical methods. They had assessed correctly that he was the key individual driving the doctrinal change in British coastal forces. What is? And they had recommended in formal intelligence language that the most efficient way to reverse British coastal forces' growing effectiveness was not to develop better weapons or different tactics. It was to remove Hitchens specifically, to target him in an operation designed to kill one man. The operation was never successfully executed. Hitchens survived every engagement in 1942 and continued commanding until April 1943. But the German assessment itself reveals something remarkable. The enemy understood before the British Admiralty fully acknowledged it, that what Hitchens represented was not just a better boat or a heavier gun. He represented a complete transformation in how coastal warfare was conceptualized. Eliminate the idea's source, and perhaps the idea could be contained. They were wrong about that. By mid-1942, the idea was already larger than any one man. The training manuals existed. The production contracts were signed. The flotilla commanders had absorbed the doctrine and made it their own. Peter Dickens, Christopher Dreyer, and a dozen other MGB commanders had internalized everything Hitchens had developed and were extending it in their own operations. The program could no longer be stopped by removing the man who had started it. Which is perhaps the most important thing Robert Hitchens ever accomplished. He made himself unnecessary. Chinde, from a weekend racing enthusiast with a borrowed desk and a proposal that Admiralty reviewers called operationally impractical, to a fundamental transformation of coastal naval warfare that outlasted him by decades and spread to 40 navies across the world. Hitchens proved that the most dangerous thing an individual can do inside an institution is be so completely right about something important that the institution eventually cannot ignore them. Over 150 German E-boats sunk or destroyed, a 70% reduction in coastal convoy losses. Thousands of merchant sailors who survived the war because the Channel's tactical balance shifted in 1942. And the blueprint for how fast attack craft have operated in every navy in the world for the 80 years since. That is the scale of what one man's refusal to accept the losing position produced. If you know a story like this one, an overlooked innovation, a dismissed idea that changed everything, a name that history buried but shouldn't have, write it in the comments. These are the stories that tell us what actually happens in wars beneath the official histories and the celebrated names. Subscribe, because this series is just beginning, and the next story we are going to tell is stranger, more unlikely, and more consequential than anything in these 4 episodes. But wars are not won by the side with the most ships or the largest armies. Wars are won by the side that figures out faster than the other side that the way they have always done things is no longer the way that works. Robert Hitchens figured that out in 1940 on a damaged boat crossing a dark channel with 2 dead men on his deck. The world is still living in the consequence of what he did next.